No nation has been feeding on more myths than this nation, and no nation is in as dire a need to awaken to reality. There are many sacred cows which we had better dissect if we are to know anything about ourselves and about our role in the world. Without this, we will be ever more at a loss to understand what the world resents about us so intensely, and why the cry of Yankee go home unites ever more hundreds of millions of people. We may start this awakening with our aboriginal combination of sin and myth. This here did not begin as the land of freedom, but the site of wanton massacres, not as a society of promise, but as perpetrator of genocide. Oh yes, it is time for Americans to study their history. It is time to look into a mirror that does not flutter and distort. This we must do not out of masochism, but because without studying the lasting effects of the genocide committed on the Indian nations of this continent, and without understanding the mechanism of rationalization it built into the American national cycle, we may never be able to develop a desired degree of self-criticism and self-correction. We must undergo the pain of realizing that the history of this nation began with genocide in order to gain the objectivity and morality necessary to reject present rationalizations that lead us into another genocide. We must eschew our national pride in order to overcome our national arrogance. We must be able to discern that image of ourselves which frightens mankind, especially its non-white races. Not only have our forefathers exterminated Indian nations, but there is virtually no remorse registered in American philosophy, literature, and art. By contrast, hypocritical as most Germans are in denying having known of Nazi atrocities, or when they claim having been unable to do anything about these atrocities, at least they are preoccupied with the problem of conscience. This is reflected in their post-war literature, theater, and press. But America, having exterminated the Indian, had no time to engage in such spiritual luxuries. Instead, she has conveniently created false images of Indians who would not co-live and who had to be killed. These images are still mass-produced by our movie industry. Such was the birth of that mind, which now causes the American to grab a gun, a plane, and a container of gas and go thousands of miles to kill a nation. Ever since that first genocide, we as a nation have learned to project intolerable danger wherever it is profitable to pretend its existence. Ever since, we have acquired a skill in finding reasons why any owner of goods in the world should be killed, and why virtue itself requires that we inherit these goods. The mechanism of rationalization that at first protected us from having to face up to the horror of our deeds to the Indians has been used in our history time and again, each use adding to our ease of applying it. It has netted us much territory from the Mexicans, and it has enabled us to inherit much from the Spaniards. When its sustainment required physical self-mutilation, the price of our own sinking domain seemed very reasonable for getting a pretext to accomplish national aggrandizement. 17 years later, the Maine had an historic sister. She too fulfilled the national mission of getting us into a war by hook or by crook. Her name was Lusitania, and she was shrouded in such mystery that for a long time it was deemed unpatriotic to mention the date of her sinking, lest people be reminded that the event we seized for declaring a war had occurred 2 years prior to the war declaration. With all this rich historic experience, the handling of Negroes was a minor task for this nation. Somehow our national historians forgot to ask the question: if we were created to be the land of the free, How come that we killed millions, yes, millions of people from Africa and turned the survivors into slaves? Nor can a full explanation of the enduring plight of Negroes in America be provided without due consideration of the mechanism of rationalization this nation has acquired in the process of killing off the Indians. For it is this very mechanism of rationalization that enables many an alleged liberal not to be all too literal when endorsing racial equality. And it is this expedient rationalization that causes the Texan who now occupies the White House to recite, "We shall overcome." Every salesman knows that he needs enthusiasm for his product to sell much of it. Similar is the function of the myth we are fed, the rationalizations we spin, and the messianic notions that we hide in our hearts. They are intended to turn us into effective conquerors of lands and nations. But it does us no good to shout from the rooftops that we are a nation dedicated to freedom. If we are to become such a nation, we had better realize which are the myths that sublimate our freedom. We had better rid ourselves of messianic notions fed by historic myth for the sake of calculable profits. Our myths are not political, at least not directly. I'm referring to those which purport to set intellectual bona fides. One of these intellectual myths has it that things are never black and white, that extremism of any kind is always wrong, that there is always virtue in moderation. I have never heard any evidence in support of these allegations, which are spread as self-evident, and I therefore take them to be mere prejudices. Certainly, nature's colors include the white of calcium and the black of coal, the day's brightness and the night's dark. Nor is there any shortage of human and social equivalents of these symbols of matter. I wonder what shade of gray anyone would assign as the proper symbol of the crematoria of Auschwitz. So there is a social black, a deep, horrible black. I also wonder how the alleged virtue of moderation would apply to these very crematoria of Auschwitz. Would it be right to let them continue their diabolic operation for a while longer? Or would moderation sanctify a mere lowering of their daily output of death? Miraculously enough, as soon as conversation switches to any organization or government that is the official or unofficial enemy, many of the apostles of moderation, anti-extremism, and middle roadism, those artists who boycott black and white, instantly forget their own grammar and do not mind engaging in a contest of who can hate more, who can depict in a deeper black, and who can present more totally devilish images. This intellectual double standard makes me suspicious, and I wonder whether it amounts to anything other than those in power in effect saying to their critics, "Do not criticize us, for we are right. Do not oppose us, for we want your support. But if oppose you must, please oppose us softly, mildly, ineffectually. Don't raise hell and don't do anything that might truly undermine our position. Be nice." Then there is the alleged intellectual virtue of personal detachment and emotional neutrality. Objectivity is identified with indifference and intellectual integrity with the technician's non-involvement. Nothing seems to endanger the reputation of an American scholar and college professor as much as a personal commitment and emotional involvement. To be a scholar in good standing, he is to prove his objectivity by displaying equal matter-of-factness on any subject, equal detachment, equal I-don't-careism. Like Eichmann, he is merely to keep the trains running. Unfortunately, many people who resist direct political manipulation accept these intellectual fallacies unaware of their connection to politics. They do not suspect that all the powers that be are out to achieve is a compliant intellectual community that easily eschews whatever notions of dissent it nurtures, and that under no circumstances becomes a serious liability. Again, there is their preference for not so opposing opponents. It seems to me that many of America's scholars and scientists, particularly of American college professors, need to be given a rather elementary lesson in logic. That emotional detachment is a virtue in evidence gathering in assessment, but that emotional detachment toward an already reached value judgment is spiritual sterility. It would be wrong to let one's emotions interfere with the assessment of facts in Vietnam, but it would be at least as wrong to remain indifferent once the inquiry identified the culprits. Alas, how polite need one be in addressing murderers? With what courtliness need one address a man, even if he happens to be the President of the United States, who every morning, presumably while having his coffee, chooses targets for American bombers from a long list of North Vietnamese villages and towns, bridges and water dams, hospitals and schools? How soft must one's voice be when protesting the rape of a land and the murder of a people? So let our voices not be modulated into the eunuch's squeak, but let us raise them loud and powerfully shout, "Here goes the murderer, and here his cohorts." And if the price for caring be intellectual bona fides, we shall be this society's outcasts and untouchables, rather than guilty of protesting American crimes in Vietnam one iota short of our ability. I am speaking about all these myths, moods, attitudes, and morals, not only because they determine the policies of our government, but also because the restlessness of which this meeting is an expression, sprung primarily from moral, not political, repulsion and outrage. Our detractors may accuse us of being the tools of foreign powers and of being brainwashed by them, but one need not send one's brain to a Chinese laundry in order to have it produce nostalgias for decency. Happening on the American college campus is not merely the emergence of political opposition to one American action abroad or another. We are confronted with a comprehensive revolt which is inspired by suppressed ethical values and philosophical precepts. Much of the youth of America have seen through the kind of society which the older generation has been preparing for them, and they refuse to enter this kind of a society. They have been exposed to vulgar pragmatism, and they don't like it. At the threshold of adulthood, they have discerned a society that buries every humane notion and ethical principle in the cemetery of cynicism, and they refuse to have their own values so buried. They have seen a society that uses concepts of truth and justice merely to cloak their real competition in greed and power. They have awakened from childhood dreams and become frightened at the realization that in the social framework prepared for them, every belief and notion of goodness and trust in others must burst like a bubble. It is not so long ago that their parents led them by their little childish hands out of the churches in which they had absorbed words of brotherhood and love, and the chill of the street of reality into which they emerged cooled their minds into the stark realization that preacher and audience alike were in tacit conspiracy to use slogans of brotherhood as verbal ornaments, that preacher and audience alike tacitly agreed that the way for man to go through life is to get ring and rest from others. They have heard the Star-Spangled Banner and watched uniformed muscle men being thrown on countries in ways not very different from the hold-up of a neighborhood bank. They have heard their presidents and representatives in the United Nations espouse freedom and democracy while glorified henchmen were invading and subduing nations that tried to free themselves from the bondage of poverty and tyranny. They have seen the society of dog eat dog, and they have seen Washington's pirate ship on the world's high seas. This American college youth refuses to accept as wisdom their parent generation's conclusion that social justice and a world at peace are contrary to human nature. These young men and women are determined to try their own hand at reshaping society. They cling to the hope that both national and international life can be predicated on decency and justice. Because we cling to these beliefs, and we will not give up these dreams, we must challenge the vulgar philosophers in the seats of power. We will not entrust our consciences to corrupt minds and hearts, and the decorum of the official planning sessions of murder will not obscure the real quality of the misdeeds. Our loyalty is the loyalty of decent human beings, not the loyalty of the crime gang. Our allegiance is to human liberty and progress, not to particular men in particular positions. Our reliance is on real democracy, not on those who pull and manipulate hidden strings. With Mark Twain we say, "My kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or its office holders. The country is the real thing, the substantial thing, the eternal thing. It is the thing to watch over and care for and be loyal to. Institutions are extraneous. They are its mere clothing, and clothing can wear out, become ragged, cease to be comfortable, cease to protect the body from winter, disease, and death. To be loyal to rags, to shout for rags, to worship rags, to die for rags, that's a loyalty of unreason. It is pure animal. It belongs to monarchy, was invented by monarchy. Let monarchy keep it." Because our loyalty is to America, but not to particular Americans, and certainly not to Americans who would have us join a conspiracy against the rest of the world, and because we see in America being subverted by those who elevate the philosophies of bandits to the status of the country's doctrines, and because we consider silence in the face of crime to be a part of the crime, and because we refuse to believe that there is no alternative to bandit relations among nations, and because this nation needs to emancipate itself and wrest America from what is in effect a continent-wide association of manufacturers and chamber of commerce, because of all this, we shall not be led by the conscienceless usurpers in Washington. We shall challenge them in every way available to us, our deeds being restricted by no false loyalties and no conscience-restraining oaths, but only by the effectiveness of our dissent. The real patriots of America, for we strive for an America at peace with the world. We are the real patriots of America, for we believe in her potential as a decent society. We are the real patriots of America, for we are willing to stake on her adherence to international law and cooperation. We are the real patriots of America, for we do not want chauvinists to blacken her name, nor to cause the whole world to hate her. To serve such an America, we call on all men of goodwill and on all groups dedicated to peace and justice wherever they are to join in the convocation of an international war tribunal to sit in judgment on those who are responsible for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, as defined by the Charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg after World War II, and as are perpetrated on the people of Vietnam. Let the administration of international justice take place not only vis-à-vis militarily defeated criminals, as was the case with the Nazi and Japanese war criminals, but let the wrath of world opinion be brought to bear against them, while it might still contribute to its stopping these crimes. The principle of individual responsibility established at Nuremberg trials is as applicable today as it was a generation ago. The President of the United States, his secretaries, advisors, aides, and troops, each single one of them must answer for his deeds no less than Adolf Eichmann had to. Let Lyndon Baines Johnson and the other executioners of the Vietnamese people be haunted by humanity's verdict against them. Even while they surround themselves with sufficient forces to protect their damnable lives, let them go on living as free men despite the loudly proclaimed verdict of mankind, whose every human sensibility has been offended by these mass murderers. Let it be written in human chronicles that in the 1960s, when political and military circumstances in another part of the world were not unlike those that prevailed in the early 1940s in Europe, humanity as a whole was not a silent accomplice, but condemned the guilty and had the integrity and courage to treat them as the criminals they were. As for Americans, let us demand the impeachment of Lyndon Baines Johnson for the high crimes he has committed on the people of Vietnam and of the United States of America. Even if such a demand for impeachment erroneously implies the existence of an effective legal recourse of the American people in case the leaders turn criminals, let us nonetheless raise it, if not as a practical challenge of the executive, at least as a clear protest against it. But with this will not be exhausted our determination to end America's genocidal war. To end it, we will do everything and anything. The wave of domestic dissent is rising, and soon people by the hundreds and then by the thousands will refuse to pay taxes so as not to contribute treasure for the extermination of the Vietnamese. By the hundreds and then by the thousands, young Americans will refuse to join the military forces on their escapades to Vietnam. By the hundreds and then by the thousands, young Americans in Vietnam will leave the ranks of the oppressors and go over to join the resistance of those who only yesterday were their prospective victims. And by the hundreds and then by the thousands, young Americans will go to Vietnam and volunteer their services to help ameliorate the suffering inflicted by their fellow countrymen upon the Vietnamese. March 16th, in a Detroit street, a friend of mine, Alice Hertz, set herself ablaze in protest against the American crimes in Vietnam. Her example will have hundreds and then thousands of Americans lay themselves across railroad tracks to prevent the dispatch to Vietnam of murder tools and their operators. We will engage in our own type of escalation. Each abortive attempt to stop this war will inspire the next step, the next action against the machine. Whatever it will take, we will stop this mass crime. There are Americans who are quite willing to sacrifice whatever is necessary, including their lives, to stop this horror. We shall do nothing less than we thought the Germans should have done to stop Hitler and his cohorts from raping and exterminating so much of Europe. We shall not be moved from our determination to stop this war. We shall not be moved from our attempts to stop this mass murder. We shall not be moved from our resolve to let the Vietnamese have their freedom. We shall not be moved from demanding that American troops be kept for the defense of America, in America, not 10,000 miles from her shores. We shall neither participate, nor acquiesce, nor be silent. We shall be neither polite nor timid in our opposition. We shall not compromise our dedication to a truly free, democratic, moral, and law-abiding America, nor our opposition to the misuse of America for aggrandizement and conquest. This is why, standing before you, I wear the concentration camp prisoner's uniform that Hitler had me were. So long as there exist concentration camps, even if in their Vietnamese version they are called security hamlets, I had rather be in them than guard them. So long as there is a military force which tries to defeat a people's right to liberty, I had rather be shot at than do the shooting. So long as whole sections of a country are subjected to extermination by fire, I had rather be among the burned than among the burners. And so long as limitless American machines of death are sent to decimate the people of Vietnam, I feel a kinship with the Vietnamese, but not with any American who participates in these inhumanities. I cannot wear this concentration camp uniform without remembering my young parents and sister who perished in the gas chamber of Auschwitz. In my memory, I see them on their death march. My parents and sister could call out to me now that other parents and sisters are being massacred in Vietnam for no fault or guilt, what would they tell me to do? Would they encourage me to join today's persecutors? Or would they want me to consider the slaughtered innocent men, women, and children of Vietnam as my own brothers and sisters, parents and children? So I'm wearing this uniform to dramatize my spiritual kinship with America's victims, precisely as this uniform once symbolized my kinship with Nazi Germany's victims. My concentration camp has not come to an end so long as there are concentration camps for others. The torture chambers of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and elsewhere have not stopped to exist so long as new versions of them have been erected on the soil of Vietnam. There are stripes in the prisoner's uniform I am wearing, and there are stripes in the American flag. Both can be taken to symbolize prison bars. The prison bars behind which American troops are fighting to keep the people of Vietnam, and the prison bars I mentally feel around me so long as America is doing this. But the American flag also has stars. Stars stand for hope. We, the American dissenters, are America's most hopeful people. We hope for a world whose relations are determined by justice, not by force, and for an America whose vitality and genius are not in conquest, but in the constructive ingenuity of her people. Out of a so-conceived patriotism, I call out to you, long live the people of Vietnam, down with the American intervention in Vietnam. Long live America, down with the Johnson war administration.